Christopher Nolan is someone who needs very little introduction. Everyone knows who he is, and most of his movies are extremely popular. There might not be anyone else in the world right now who can go into a meeting, pitch an original idea, and essentially be given a blank check. And those risky bets studios have been making for decades now have continued to pay off. And although some of his films aren't exactly my thing, most of them definitely are, which made me want to make a fun little video where I try and rank them and give some of my thoughts. Nope. Truth be told, I've never seen Insomnia all the way through, and I don't plan on finishing it anytime soon. I watched it for the first 40 or so minutes and was bored beyond belief. I try to not be super negative when talking about movies and art, so I'll just say this movie and Al Pacino's performance in particular just wasn't for me. I should note though that I think a large part of this is due to the fact that Nolan didn't write this screenplay, and that way this does feel not entirely like his own film. It really does feel like the odd one out. Tenet is one of the clunkiest movies I've ever seen. I was beyond excited for this release back in 2020, but when I watched it for the first time, and when I've watched it since, it just doesn't feel like the type of movie I can really click with. More than any of Nolan's films, this really did feel like style over substance. To put it simply, there's just too much going on, and none of it had me invested. It felt like some type of scavenger hunt for the audience, where they would have to inevitably end up on YouTube trying to have someone explain what a Rotas square is and what the rules of inversion are. On top of that, the villain is a cartoonish megalomaniac with ridiculous motives. The plot is too convoluted for its own good, and the score is flat out silly. In my opinion, the only thing this film has working for it are some of the action sequences, in particular that cheese grater scene, and the two lead performances from John David Washington and Robert Pattinson. They were both fantastic. Memento is a cool movie, you know? Like, I don't find it to be this super thought-provoking film that a lot of people do, but it is cool for sure. To me, it's like a really good episode of The Twilight Zone. It's very engaging when you first watch it. You're hooked, but after you've seen how it ends, it kind of loses its appeal. Maybe you can go back through, pick up some of the details that you didn't notice the first time, but that's about all for me. I think this is a great example of a project that starts out almost as a thought experiment and blossoms into an entire story, which is more than anything a testament to how well written it is. While obviously not my favorite of the bunch, this movie has gotten better and better with every rewatch, and it seems like no one ever talks about this anymore. That's probably because 1, it's almost 20 years old, and 2, the sequel is better in every way. But still, this movie deserves its flowers. I'm all for any version of Batman that makes Gotham appear gothic and Bruce appear lost. That's what I love about this story and the character. And this movie as a whole is undeniably a very solid foundation for the trilogy. The Prestige is a dope movie that has a lot working for it. I love the old-timey London town aesthetic. The idea of dueling magicians going mad while pushing each other to violent heights is as fascinating as it sounds. I also think the huge twists and turns don't really dampen the rewatch value for me, which is very rare for any film that relies so heavily on its mystery. Plus, the cast is amazing. It is a tragedy that a movie with Michael Caine, Andy Serkis, and David Bowie, who plays Nikola Tesla, isn't higher, but here we are. And the reason I can't put it just a pinch higher is a combination of the two main characters. While I love seeing them become rivals and being blown away by the wild stuff they do to each other, I don't feel a lot of the emotional concern for them that I think Nolan wanted me to. I wasn't unconcerned, but I also wasn't in pure suspense, waiting to see what their fate was either. They just fell a bit flat for me, but overall, this is still a very exciting film. Probably the biggest surprise here, I like Inception and I appreciate what it did for non-IP, big budget blockbuster filmmaking in Hollywood. It's been out for over 10 years now, and I think I can safely say that this is a bona fide classic. Everything about it is iconic, and it's absolutely a staple for the sci-fi genre. The sets, the score, the story structure, that's all fantastic. However, this movie has gotten a little stale for me over time. Similar to what I said about Memento, I think this movie loses its appeal a little more every time I revisit it. However, unlike Memento, I think the classic trope of Nolan giving his lead character a dead wife works a little bit better here. As a matter of fact, the story of Cobb and his total connection to the past does most of the heavy lifting in my opinion. The subplot with Cillian Murphy and his father is very good as well, and I always feel emotionally invested with those aspects of the film. And I don't want to get it twisted, Inception is an awesome movie. I'm just probably not as high on it as most people are. Oppenheimer was amazing, and it was far from what I was expecting, but even better than I could have hoped. Despite being the longest film on this list at 3 hours, it is by far the most patient movie and the only true character study Nolan has ever made. And what a character to study. The way we see Oppenheimer examined in the first half of the film is mostly as this brilliant but pretty narcissistic man who loves to indulge in all sorts of vices, and then in the second half as a guilt-ridden Dr. Frankenstein who seems to be haunted by his own creation. And some of the filmmaking and creativity used to show that panic and that guilt is just brilliant. I should also give the most obvious praise and note that the imagery that accompanied the "Can You Hear the Music" score was pure movie magic. Having all that take place inside his mind was just as brilliant. It is simply amazing that creative people out there can do what they did with practical effects. I saw this movie in theaters twice, and I am still in awe at how good it looks. It's one of the cleanest and most crisp war movies to date. The color palette screams signature Nolan. You can feel the scope of the story, you get lost in the size of these images. It's impossible not to be blown away by the perfect use of practical effects and sets that led to some seemingly impossible shots. But what works better than anything is the edge of your seat tension that comes from the ticking clock style of editing. It's almost like Nolan realized that, in a general sense, his biggest strengths are story and spectacle, and his biggest weakness is typically character. So he just made a spectacular story and didn't write any characters. And that's more than okay with me. In this movie, the characters are purposely playing second fiddle to the story. There's not really a lead character either. It's more multiple storylines chopped together to give different perspectives on the experience of this event. It's like the point of this movie is to show Dunkirk, the event. There are only characters here as a means for the story to be told. It's also like this could have been filmed with zero dialogue, and it would have essentially been telling the same story. I also just want to say I think it's a relief to see Nolan not doing sci-fi, but keeping the same lofty ambitions and budget. I'll just get it out of the way. I saw this movie 5 times in 11 days when it came out. Shout out my buddy Dean. So even though I have some serious nostalgia, I've never understood the distaste for this movie. It's one of the most emotionally resonant superhero films I've ever seen, and a great ending to the series. Bale gives what is undeniably his best performance of the trilogy. Tom Hardy, despite having impossible shoes to fill, exceeded my expectations and turned Bane into an iconic, legendary character with unbelievable screen presence, and the rest of the cast is just another fantastic ensemble in a Christopher Nolan movie. Obviously, Ledger was unparalleled in The Dark Knight, but as a whole, the acting in this movie is the best of the trilogy. Hans Zimmer's score is immaculate, and as always, his work elevated the movie. I also particularly loved the audio quality in this film. During the back-breaking scene, for instance, I always hear the falling water, all the individual footsteps, and of course Bane's iconic mask. This movie had to follow a film that genuinely changed mainstream filmmaking. That's never easy, and because of that reason, it doesn't surprise me that people aren't crazy about this movie the way I am. What does surprise me is how much people get caught up in the, quote, plot holes and conveniences. When I watch this movie, none of that ever seems relevant. And if ever there's something that I can't figure out, I remember that this is a fantasy story about a genius superhero with basically unlimited resources at his disposal, so I'm sure he can figure out how to get around some tricky obstacles. Also, I just have to mention Alfred's Oscar-worthy conversation with Bruce about Rachel's letter. I mean, what a scene. I don't even know what to say. I feel like I can close my eyes and just watch this movie in my mind. I've seen it so many times. We all know it's great. It's a classic movie. It's genre defining. We got an all-time great performance from Ledger. There's nothing more for me to add, man. It's The Dark Knight. I made a video before trying to analyze some of the symbolism in it that's on my channel. But outside of that, I don't have anything else to add to the conversation. This movie rules. It'll always rule. It's not my favorite Nolan movie anymore, but when I was 12 and this came out, I thought it would just be my favorite movie forever. This is Nolan's best movie. The story itself is just another Earth is in the toilet, we have to find a new planet kind of scenario. However, the emotional and albeit predictable story beats are executed in a way that is extremely satisfying. For instance, we know that when Cooper leaves Earth, it means he's leaving his family and may never see them again. This was destined to be emotional, but it was great writing and beautiful acting that made this aspect of the story as unbelievably powerful as it is. If you've seen this movie, I'm sure you know exactly what scenes in particular that I'm talking about. It's heart-wrenching stuff. And it's no secret that this is considered Nolan's most emotionally impactful film. McConaughey gives such a great performance here. His character, Cooper, is so easy to root for. He seems like an everyman and a Superman at the same time. And I absolutely love that. Like, if you ever needed a heartbreaking story about an astronaut farmer and his genius daughter, look no farther. There are moments between those two that will crush anybody. And I've somehow gotten this far without talking about the absolutely stunning visuals and all-around technical mastery in this film. This is so far beyond just a normal summer blockbuster. This movie will look and sound good literally forever. It is miraculous what this movie manages to accomplish with its incredibly bold journey in outer space, and the score, especially in the docking scene, is perfect. That moment is the most tense scene in Nolan's entire filmography, and one of the most thrilling and anxiety-inducing scenes ever put to film. The score sends my heart beating out of my chest. I cannot stress enough how above and beyond great the score, the scope, and spectacle are in this film. And that's the thing with Interstellar. It's the type of movie that reminds you why you watch movies. Christopher Nolan is a living legend. In my lifetime, there's been no one else quite like him. All of his movies are massive hits, and because of that, he gets so much artistic and financial freedom to do whatever he wants, which always makes the announcement of one of his films so exciting. We all know going into one of his movies that no matter what we'll certainly get is something grand and bold and breathtaking, which is a huge positive for filmmaking in general. And moving forward, I have no reason to believe that he doesn't have a few more great movies just waiting to be made.